Okay, I think finally we're ready to start. Thank you for waiting so patiently and so quietly. The theme of this panel is the part of Russia that I guess Russian economy that the rest of the world is less focused on traditionally than the commodities, oil and gas sector. And to discuss the prospects for the rest of Russia's economy, we have a very high-powered panel indeed. On the far end, Yulia Slashcheva, CEO of CTC Media, Artem Konstandian, CEO of Promosphere Bank. Immediately to my left, Matthias Westman, who is founding partner of Prosperity Capital. To my right, Drew Guff, managing director and founding principal of Segula Guff. And then to his right, Roman Trachtenberg, who is managing director of Luxoft, and a company that's recently gone public on the New York Stock Exchange, which I guess is one reason that we're intrigued to hear from you. And so, I mean, as the Dow hits 16,000 today and breaks new records, you know, what's the outlook for your company, do you think, and for Russian business to start breaking records for the share valuations?
Look, we're very optimistic. So I think the last time I checked, we're about 7% up today. So we are enjoying the 16,000 breakthrough.
You should speak at the New York Stock Exchange more often.
Yeah.
And we'll go up 7%
I'm around.
every day.
I'm around. So I guess the panel is called Beyond Oil and Gas, which is, I think, just the exact point where we fit. So I just want to say a couple of words. When we came to the market in year 2000, right, the entire foundation of Luxoft was a firm belief that the quality of Russian engineering workforce is really world class. And combine that with the soft skills, partnership mentality, work ethics, that pulling it together and making it available to the Western market would create a success. So basically, you know, 13 years later, you know, we've proven that this model works. Our company is very Western focused. There's most of our clients are, you know, Western firms, and they came to realize and recognize the value that we provide. So for me, I think you know, looking at the overall sector, right? So you know, we're in services, so that's the area I understand. But one simple fact I want to quote: I believe that our success is built on the sort of quality of technical education system, right? So that's what we've been very sort of fortunate to have in Russia, and I think in general the quality of education is very high. So educated workforce combined with the industry that has, you know, limited regulation is a recipe for success when investing in Russia. That would be my feel. And what I also like to say is about just 25% of the graduates are in technology or science. So we're looking at a pretty vast market of other services that I think for the years to come could be a very interesting opportunity, right? Healthcare, operational. It's you know, I think it's a vast market. That'd be my sense. Thank you.
Great. So, Matthias, I mean, as someone that's invested broadly in Russia for some time, I mean, give us a sense of, you know, outside of the oil and gas sector, where has it been so far most fruitful to invest, and how are you starting to think, or how are you now thinking about, you know, the next 10 years compared to the last 10 years, and what the risks and opportunities are?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, this it will be in about 3 weeks' time. It will be 20 years since we started investing in Russia. So we've been doing this for a long time, and we've seen how all these companies have developed, and what is driving the increase in shareholder value in all these companies. And largely, it's what you're talking about here, that, you know, we've seen an immense increase in productivity, and this productivity coming from you know, starting with companies in the Soviet mold, very inefficient. Of course, there's a lot of scope for improvements. And a large part of these improvements come from adopting modern management techniques, modern information technology. And this is that's where we see that Russia actually has a very good opportunity going forward, how these companies modernize themselves. It's not so much a matter of whether this is outside oil and gas or in whichever sector it is, because you can modernize an oil company by introducing modern field management techniques and modern management techniques and marketing and finance methodologies. Or you can take a little retail company that had one store in '99 called Magnet that now opens 1,600 stores per year and create a wonderful company. But clearly you can see that the better part of entrepreneurship and the better part of management comes from these sectors which are more exposed to competition. If you have an oil company, you're making money almost in any case, But if you're in a tough environment in retailing or in any service business, then only the best survive in reality. So we find most of the really well-run companies in those sectors. And we see as our job to try to identify these entrepreneurs. I think a lot of people, to the extent they invest in Russia at all, look at Russia and other emerging markets as some form of macro play. And that may be true in some ways, but macro is just an aggregation of micro. And we see specific companies, specific entrepreneurs, specific ownership groups who really create valuable companies. And that's where we want to focus on. I don't think it's really reasonable to go just by sector.
But if you did segment out, the macro play that was an oil and gas commodity play from the rest of the economy, over the last 10 years, how would that macro play have?
Well, I mean, certainly we've seen better overall returns, particularly in terms of profitability in these consumer-facing industries, because you've had we had extremely fragmented sectors early on, and now we're seeing a drive towards consolidation. You have the strong growth in terms of demand, but even more so that you're driven by higher margins through consolidation and more and more efficient modern management techniques. There were no people in Russia really who knew anything about how to run a business. The business education was non-existent, so there was a lot lacking. But now you have a new generation of young people, people in their 30s and 40s who run most of the Russian companies, and they run it much more efficiently, in a much more modern way. And in some ways, this is also an interesting thing, but there's a lot of focus on what is wrong with Russia. I mean, you heard the discussion earlier today. But we've had 20 years investing in Russia. The country and all the companies are immeasurably much better run now than they were then. So there is progress going on. And then you wonder, our portfolio has an average PE of 4.5. Is that a reasonable valuation when you have relatively fast-growing businesses with increasing margins? That's questionable.
Juliana, you've taken over the CEO-ship of CTC Media. I mean, how is the media industry shaping up in Russia? I mean, I guess this is an industry that is undergoing dramatic change everywhere in the world. So there's this sort of global trends at work as well. But what are the opportunities that you see?
Okay. Yes, I've started very recently, and last week it was my 100 days with CTC Media as the CEO. I was running media businesses before, but TV business is probably the most exciting. Broadcasting is the most exciting business I could imagine. However, I was given a very good recommendation during the lunch today. Because of the broadcasting industry in Russia and in many other countries are considered very much state-influenced business, no matter we don't have a state investor, we're a commercial company. But as they are considered, media in general considers to be very state-influenced, we should start positioning ourselves not a media company anymore. So I would say we're an innovative company distributing entertainment content. So I will start positioning and presenting us like that to investors. Maybe we will start getting less undervaluation compared to what we have now. Speaking seriously about the market, the advertising market in Russia is sustainably growing for last several years, and TV advertising market is growing as well. We have a high single digits of growth, and that's something we expect for next year as well. And of course, traditional media is changing a lot. And you know that probably better than I do, that a lot of digital media appearing, a lot of digital news wires, a lot of digital information sources, and the same is happening with the entertainment. People are now watching a lot of video on the internet, and all the media companies need to develop there, and having the free-to-air as the core business, and being a number two largest commercial broadcaster in Russia, in the most monetized audience, 10-45 of age. We think seriously that we need to go digital, we need to develop in this area, and that actually would be very essential for all media companies, and all over the world it's already happening, and Russia is catching up very fast with this trend.
Artem, I mean, tell us about the banking sector and what you're seeing.
You know,
Sorry.
that's interesting. Actually, the banking, the retail banking and consumer finance is the industry from where most of the developed markets, the broadcasters get their advertising revenues a lot. In Russia, there's consumer finance and consumer retail only brings about 1% of the whole advertising money to TV, and that gives me a sense that that's one of the drivers for the growth of our market within next 2, 3 to 5 years, because the competition in consumer finance and in retail finance will grow, and I think that will add some additional players and will add some revenues to all the broadcasters, to TV and to the internet as well.
So Artem Konstantian, I mean, the banking sector, from your perspective, do you share that view? Is that going to see a lot more advertising and driving that part of the economy? But what's your perspective on Russia at the moment?
So the specific answer about advertising, that advertising will move furthermore on and on to the internet rather to the regular TV. However, so TV will still have its piece. But talking more generally, I would like to say that already today that Russia is not just oil and gas. And beyond oil and gas, well, for Russia is not just the future of the economy, it is the today's business. Well, of course, when we talk about the dependence on oil price, we talk about the budget revenues specifically, exports of the country. But if you look at the composition of the GDP, you see there's a huge contribution of services, including the financial services, and not just financial services. And I'm absolutely sure that the proportion of oil and gas further on will slow down, will go down, and non-crude materials, so industries and and services will play a more important role. So I'm talking not just about the financial sectors. I'm absolutely sure about the future of such industries like IT, as such industries as automobile producers, for the mass automobile producers, the low class, I would say economy class residential construction. And I would specifically mention not an industry, but a huge part of the economy called SME. Across the industries, across the regions, those entrepreneurs which, despite all the obstacles they need to overcome, imposed by the state, by the local authorities, and unfair competitors, is rising, and we feel it as we are one of the biggest SME banks in Russia, and the growth rate of this part of the economy, which has little to do with oil and gas, will grow pretty high in the forthcoming years. I'm sure about it.
Great. True. Last but not least, how do you see this the Russian economy beyond oil and gas?
So there's, every time I speak to students, I like to ask the question, what is Russia's greatest natural resource? And some students put their hand up and they say it's gas, some oil, diamonds, gold. And every now and then I'll get someone who'll put their hand up and they'll say, they'll say, people. And Roman's company, Luxoft, is a company that went public this year on the New York Stock Exchange. And I'm sure you chose New York for the same reasons that one of our companies did last year. It has access to technology investors, investors around the world who understand IT. And you look at the number of programmers from the region, Russia particularly, but also Ukraine and Belarus, trained in the old system. But now with market caps that are larger than $1 billion, larger than several $1 billion, growing at 30+% per annum, that's the real natural resource of Russia. That's the kind of activity that you see that's off the stock exchange when the companies are initially founded. They're founded by entrepreneurs. In this case, famous IT technologist Karachinsky, Anatoly Karachinsky. In the case of the company we took public, a guy named Dobkin, founded their companies, grew them, took on some public, some private equity investors, seasoned them, grew, and then got ready and did their IPO. The weight of the commodities companies on the Russian exchange or the indices is still extremely high, but that's not any different for Russia than it is for Brazil or China or India for that matter. It's still 85% plus heavily weighted in extractive industries, mining, metals, the big banks, and maybe a telco or two. What you don't have yet, but that are coming through the pipeline, are the companies in the sectors like IT, like healthcare, although Russia saw one last year in healthcare and hospitals. I think you'll see more in that activity. E-commerce, debottlenecking, all the areas, payment systems, all the things you need to deliver goods, those are growing at multiples, many multiples of nominal GDP growth, and represents a different sector than what you have in the mining and metals industries, which are now highly cyclical and trade at very low PEs.
So a couple of follow-up questions on that. I mean, just sketch out for us what the pipeline, for the next 2 or 3 years would look like for New York Stock Exchange quality companies, and maybe also for companies that might list on other exchanges that are less rigorous in some of their analysis of the kind of quality of the companies. I mean, think of London or whatever.
London, yeah, well.
I mean, are we talking dozens? Are we talking a handful of companies? Which?
I think you're talking handfuls, somewhere in between. And I think we'll see a few more IT companies. I think we'll see some of the transportation and these debottlenecking opportunities that I mentioned. I think we'll see a few in healthcare, or at least some secondaries that might come out. But in total, I know that the government's focus on privatization will present companies that are much bigger than the ones that I'm talking about, and they can absorb a lot more capital, but they'll be of a different magnitude.
Matthias, I mean, as an investor, I mean, there sounds like there's going to be this flow of IPO opportunities, but what about for the private equity investor who wants to go in earlier in the process? What's the environment like for them?
We mainly invest in, or almost exclusively invest in public companies. And there's a little bit of a problem here because the low valuation of many of the listed companies makes it quite difficult for all but a few private companies to list, because the entrepreneurs, the main shareholders, don't really want to sell at the valuations that are being offered on the stock exchange, except for the IT-related companies. So you have a little bit of a problem broadening the stock exchange until you have a higher valuation on the stock exchange. And in order to have that, and we've had a lot of discussions about this, is that you need to see further improvements on corporate governance, further enforcement of corporate governance rules, further understanding that, particularly from state-controlled companies, that whatever they do will be seen as what the Russian market does. So if we can see further improvements on corporate governance, then we will see higher valuations, then we will see an easing of the constraints of capital for a lot of Russian companies, and you will see further privatization. So we work very intensively to try to improve the corporate governance of Russian companies, both with specific companies, but also discussing what needs to be done with the government. And I think that's really the key to unleashing a lot of the IPOs, to get valuations higher, where entrepreneurs would be willing to sell. Right now, they feel that they're better off growing a little bit slower and not taking external capital than taking external capital at these low prices.
And I mean, what's your sense of what the impact of that difficult public market has been on other sources of capital? I mean, there is a shortage essentially of good quality companies to invest in, or?
Well, there are a lot of good companies, and anyway, as an investor, you are investing mainly in how they develop. You look at what the company is like today, and you can try to figure out if it's better next year. And of course, you can say that all the flaws that we can see in some of the Russian companies are also opportunities. I mean, we do see improvements, and we have the minister here and so on, and even if we have from time to time have complaints, there have clearly been a lot of improvements. So if you have big companies trading at P's of 3 and 4 and 5, and you also think that they're improving, then they can be very good, attractive investments. But we have to make sure that they are improving. And I think we see a positive trend, and we have seen a very positive trend. If you compare what the Russian companies were like 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, they are unrecognizably more efficient. They have much better management. There's a new generation of management teams that have come and taken over the companies. There's still a lot of work left to do, but as long as we're going in the right direction, then I think we can have a very attractive investment outlook.
Artem, I mean, you've been talking about the small and medium enterprise sector, which is growing. I mean, I guess looking at the States in particular, people have become increasingly focused on the difference between small and medium enterprises that are basically going to sort of grow on a relatively slow trajectory, maybe sort of bump along, and the gazelles, the sort of fast-growing companies that are going to go from being small to being large companies. As you look at the sector, are we starting to see those kind of fast-growing companies, or are you really just seeing the filling out of a sort of Mittelstand type of sector?
So this is an interesting question. Well, I think, so due to the size of the economy, we will see both. So there is definitely a potential, and whether this potential will be realized, in fact, of course, is dependent on many reasons. And actually, the access towards financing is just one, and maybe not the most important one. So I think that the most important thing is lack of managerial skills on that level of entrepreneurs, which, well, of course, is not, and this gap is not very easy, to stop. So governments and the active participants, including organizations, the unions of entrepreneurs, and actually, so the biggest banks that are involved in SME business try to stop this gap, to put those entrepreneurs to to upgrade their level of understanding of business, so including not just financing, but more education, tutorship, and venture financing, which is only appearing for that sort of businesses in Russia. But as long as we go along this path, I'm absolutely sure that the potential of business in most of the Russian regions for those types of companies, smaller ones, is really immense. Now, well, I'm not sure we will soon see them listed on the New York Stock Exchange, but they will contribute to the economic development, which will help those bigger ones to come to the level for becoming listed in Moscow, London, or New York.
So, Roman, I mean, you've obviously succeeded in getting far enough to be on the New York Stock Exchange and performing well. I mean, what were the biggest challenges you had to overcome along the way to reach that point? And do you find you are offering advice to other entrepreneurs as to how to overcome those issues?
Well, I think the most important lessons we learned is this sort of necessity to innovate, right? So we competed against very solid players, both Western, Southeast Asian. So I think our ability to consistently invent something new, whether it's a business model or a service offering, and be consistently on top, I think what makes us unique and what helped us get here. So I would say that is the most important factor. Just don't stand still.
And what about issues like financing, managerial talent, those kinds of things?
Well, we have as far as financing, we never really had an issue. So our organic growth was very solid. We did a private placement at a time when we needed to make an investment, strategic investment. We had no trouble getting financing for acquisitions that we've done. So on the managerial side, I think the key competence that we developed coming into a market which had great, engineering skills, but management clearly, was something that we had to learn ourselves, is that making investments in human capital and growing your own workforce was key. Obviously, when we did need to acquire expertise, we did so. I personally had a career in the US and UK. I moved to Moscow. I spent quite a bit of time in our Moscow offices. So I think the key quality of the company, and that goes back to my innovation, whatever that is, HR, the offering, technical skills. I think that's the key.
Juliana, you mentioned, I think, half joking, that you wanted to rebrand yourself away from being a media company for political reasons. And I guess a question that Duncan Niederauer also brought up in the earlier discussion. I mean, there is this perception that seems to me to be right in at least some sectors of the Russian economy, that political risk is very high for domestic, for Russian investors and entrepreneurs and business people. And then there's a second degree of political risk when I guess we look at the sort of people who might be investing on the New York Stock Exchange as they think about the political risk of Russian equities. But I'm interested to get your sense of, how should we think about political risk, and how do Russian business people think about political risk as they go about what they do?
I think that the political risks are much less perceived by Russian business people than they are perceived by the investors on the stock exchanges or international investors at all. I was surprised to face the situation when CTC Media, as the purely entertainment commercial company, having both international and Russian shareholders, actually have the majority stake, which belongs to Modern Times Group, which is the very well-positioned strategic investor into media. And still, like being a company with the very good corporate governance as with an international investor, we still are being perceived as the risky part of their whole environment because being a media company. But you know, always, I think the investors always should think risks versus opportunities. The Russian advertising, TV advertising market is the most rapidly growing market, which is now ranked number 3 and will become number 1 advertising market in Europe in 2015. And the CAGR of growth year by year to year is always the high single digits for many years sustainably. So always when it comes to the investments, risks and opportunities are weighted. And if to look on our industry, on media industry, staying away from politics, staying away from news, being a purely entertainment company, actually multi-platform entertainment company, not just being on free-to-air TV, but also being on internet, on web, on mobile, on every platform that could be monetized. We do think that the risks are minimal, like political risk. Politics doesn't interfere in our business at all anyhow. And generally, I think that this overall political risk in Russia is a little bit exaggerated from the reality. That's my feeling.
Artem, why don't you come in?
I jump in anyway on that one, because I fully agree with you that people dream up, various scenarios of political risks, and for many investors around the world, Putin himself is some form of threshold issue. They've decided that they don't like him, and therefore they won't look at the Russian market or the Russian companies. But our experience over 20 years is that it's very, very rare that the Russian government acts with bad will. And they may not always be as efficient as we would like them to be, and that probably goes for governments in every country. But they are executing reforms. We are not afraid that of political risk. The concerns we have are almost always relating to corporate governance risks, and to some extent that's lack of enforcement of some of the rules, which you can maybe ascribe to the government to some extent. But this whole concept that investors around the world have is that you need to be afraid of the Russian government. I think that's entirely wrong.
I mean, I just if I randomly look at what the Economist may have written about Russian government in the last year or so. I mean, I guess we've talked a bit about Bill Browder and Hermitage Capital and the prosecution of a dead person for tax avoidance and so forth, and so forth. Mr. Khodorkovsky being in jail, a number of things of that kind, which paint a different picture of the Russian government at a political risk. I mean, do you avoid that by picking your sector very carefully, or by?
Well, I mean, all of those stories are much more complex than they are made out to be to start with. There's no doubt that Mr. Khodorkovsky was guilty of various crimes, including tax avoidance. And we'll see. Maybe he'll be out soon. We'll see what the government does. There will be an amnesty in December, apparently. Of course, the issue with the Hermitage and so on is more serious, but it's questionable if that's really the government. I mean, these were some criminal people who, through some gaps in the Hermitage structures, were able to commit a crime. And unfortunately, not all of those criminals have been caught. But that's not really the same as the Russian government doing anything to these people. I mean, I think it's easy for Western governments to create some image that the Russian government is responsible for everything that happens in Russia. I mean, they have all powers, but they are stupid. I think that's a very, that's not the true picture at all. I mean, it's a large country that is difficult to control, and you cannot, decide what everybody does. And I think our experience is, of course, that there are difficult issues in terms of corporate governance from time to time, and people behaving badly. And we work very hard to rectify those situations one by one, plus we work very hard to kind of help educate the Russian government on what they need to do in order to improve the structures. And little by little, it's getting better. But I don't think you should call this political risk as such. I mean, there are criminals in Russia. There are criminals in all countries.
Artem, you wanted to come in on that?
Yes, I wanted to comment on that. Of course, I don't want to say that there are no political risks in Russia. Of course, they are. But I'm sure that they are strongly, significantly exaggerated by the Western media. And I don't want to make general comments. So just an example of our company, which is 18 years old company. We are so $25 billion plus so asset bank, mid-sized according to international scale, but it's a sizable pan-Russian business in my homeland. And there was no single case, so in the history of the bank, where any significant world politician tried to influence any decision, to dictate or prompt, nothing of that kind. Well, of course, one would argue that so they have some stately owned banks who will do that. I don't want to comment on that. I'm saying that most of the business, so in Russia, in their life, do not come across the real political influence, and is developed, well, subject to market conditions, internal and external.
Drew, I'm going to come to you on this as well.
Well, I think there's no greater market in the world that has a greater disparity between inside perception and outside perception than Russia does. If you ask businesses, U.S. businesses that are active in Russia, I'm on the board of the U.S.-Russia Business Council, so that represents U.S. companies doing business in Russia. And once a year at the board meeting, the members go around and talk about what's happening in their business. Almost to a company, the comments around the table would be something like, it took us a little longer to get established because of Russia's a different market than most. But once we started our business and established our business, our profit margins are better, our growth has been better than what we've seen in other emerging markets like China. I feel for Juliana, in your case. I represent the private equity industry. We've been investing in Russia also for 20 years. We've owned 40 different companies. One of them was MTV, Music Television Russia. We launched MTV, we grew it, eventually sold it. No one ever from the government told us what to run, what to do, what to say. It was free and open, free-to-air broadcasting to the entire country. We were an entertainment channel, no longer own it. I wish we did. It was a lot of fun to own at the time. But most people don't realize that you can invest in free-to-air broadcasting in Russia. Mm-hmm. You can't do that in China. You can't do that in a lot of so-called really attractive emerging markets. So Russia's freer in that sense. There was a group of US senators who went to Russia about 9 months ago. And they came back, and one of their first, they were asked, what were your impressions? And one of the senators said, I was shocked to learn that the internet isn't censored in Russia. Well, that just tells you that at that sophisticated a level, the lack of understanding is colossal. And it only points to what Sergei Belyukov was saying before. What do we need more of? We need more engagement, more businesses to visit, more students to exchange, more people-to-people associations, because the perception of Russia is wildly different than the reality. And likewise, as foreign investors investing in Russia, it goes the other way, that the Russian perceptions of foreigners, and particularly Americans, also isn't good when the overall political environment isn't good, and when those perceptions and the old stereotypes tend to keep getting reinforced.
Now, Roman, I spend a lot of time talking to American businessmen who complain about President Obama the whole time and urge him to do something about the Obamacare mess or whatever. Do you feel the urge to get on the phone to President Putin and say, come on, this gay rights thing is doing us no good, the perception of political interference everywhere, can you back off a bit and help us change our perception to outside investors?
Well, what I would say, agreeing with most of what was said earlier, the perception of risk is over-exaggerated, and I think the assessment of opportunity is not there, right? So I doubt one phone call will change this all. I think it's going to be a series of events and phone calls and travels that will change that perception. But going back to, I think, what we discussed the market presents incredible opportunities. And to an extent, I think the fact that, that there are so many successful companies in the technology space that essentially are leaders of the market just indicates that, at some point earlier on, VCs, private equity investors with all the back-end and multi-year expertise in selected fields did not recognize the opportunity or overestimated the risks.
I wanted to end on one positive note from each panelist to say, what's the one thing the most positive thing that we're going to see from the non-oil and gas part of Russia over the next 12 months, do you think? If you had to pick one story that's going to emerge that's a very strong positive story.
I feel that investments into the segments that are now well represented on the Western markets, such as IP-intensive, software business, internet and e-commerce, and technology services. I feel that there will be more innovation, and the innovation is driven by the new market participants. And I feel that there will be a lot more. Focus by the Western investors on those selected segments.
Drew?
I'll continue that thread. I think Russian companies that have come to understand the global technology marketplace, those that are part of the bridge between Russia and Silicon Valley, we're going to see a jump from the service companies now into companies that actually provide products and algorithms. I predict we'll see in the next 5 years 5 Russian entrepreneurs who become worth more than $1 billion from their software companies that sell products.
Right, Matthias?
Okay, well, of course, these are very valid points, and also we would like to emphasize again that the real thing that's going to drive Russia forward is its very well-educated workforce. But I think the thing that will hopefully change how the market works is really further progress on the issue of corporate governance, because that's really what's holding the valuation back. And so if we can make some regulatory changes, some improvements on this level, then all of a sudden some of these companies can trade at multiples of where they trade now.
Artem?
My favorites are IT, retail, and financial services.
I'll give the last word to you, Yulia.
No, of course, I agree with my colleagues that those are mostly technological companies, financial services and consumer finance, and of course media. Because media is this bridge between everything.
It's not called
so
media
if
anymore.
needed to be in the Silicon Valley, we will do the bridge to Silicon Valley.
Not all the media,
distributing-
but entertainment distribution.
Yeah, entertainment distribution, right? Yeah, as a innovative distributor of entertainment content, we can do a bridge whenever we need to go, if it's monetized and well perceived. And I do think that Russian companies should convey more positive stories publicly, internationally. That's all about reputation. That's all about trust, about people who represent companies. And if we do more, if the corporates who want to build its network internationally will do more about that, everybody will win. Thank you.
Great. Well, on that note, I would like to thank the panel for a very stimulating conversation and invite the next panelists to come forward and get mic'd up and everything. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.